Cancellations, backup plans, exiting a deal, side ponytail, little ponytails. What is that? Hey guys, it's Lauren. This is my Weber Weekly Update, and today I want to talk about both the buyer and the seller's rights to cancel a contract. So I'm going to break this down in essence of the timeline from start to finish. The buyer goes and sees the house, they love it, and they write an offer. That offer is called the residential purchase agreement. They submit to the seller their price and all the terms, and those terms is the lay of the land of the entire escrow, the entire contract and agreement between buyer and seller. So usually they will submit their offer, the seller may counter, they can go back and forth until they have a mutual agreement and a binding agreement. Once the seller accepts the buyer's offer, they have what's called a fully executed offer. Once the seller accepts it, day one will start on the day after acceptance. And that is the whole timeline of the contract that we have pre-agreed to, and it has different timeline deadlines written throughout the contract. So for example, the buyer must wire into escrow typically within 3 days of acceptance their earnest money deposit. That's usually 3% of the purchase price, and that earnest money deposit is what's protected by 3 main contingencies that the buyer has to protect that money. Those contingencies have timelines, and that's also what has been agreed upon by buyer and seller. So for example, typical timeline is 3 days to get your earnest money deposit in, 10 days to remove your inspection contingencies, 14 days to remove your appraisal contingencies, 21 days to remove your loan contingencies, and 30 days to close. So those are timelines that the buyer is agreeing to perform and do all of the things that they need to do to remove those contingencies and act accordingly to the timeline. Okay, so the earnest money deposit that I have mentioned is in my fist. And those 3 main contingencies protect it, like I mentioned. As they're going through the timeline on day 10, when they remove their first contingency, they're saying, I'm good with the condition of the house. Now that I've removed this contingency, if for any reason that I cancel based off of inspections and investigations, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you can have this, my earnest money deposit. But if it's still protected by 2 more contingencies, they move on to the next phase. Once they get their appraisal back and they're good with the value and the conditions and they remove that, they can no longer cancel or renegotiate based on the appraisal findings. And such is so for the loan. Once they removed all 3, that earnest money deposit is then up for risk. And if they cancel for any of those reasons, they are no longer protected and the seller can keep some of those funds. Now, the seller can only cancel once they've agreed to a fully executed purchase contract and sign off on it. They can only cancel if the buyer is not performing within that agreed upon timeline. So if they don't get their earnest money deposit in the 3 days or the time frame that they agreed to, the seller can issue what's called a notice to perform. After the buyer receives the notice to perform, they still have 48 hours to perform, do what they're not doing, whether it's not getting their earnest money deposit in or removing any of those contingencies or closing escrow on the agreed upon close of escrow date. If they don't do what the seller is asking them to do, like, hey buyer, you're not removing your inspection contingency, they have 48 hours to do that, or the seller can cancel the deal. So there's a little bit of a process of how the buyer starts to commit themselves to buying the home, and there's a little bit of a process of how a seller can try to cancel the deal with the buyer. But the buyer has the option to perform, and if they're acting accordingly, the seller cannot cancel the deal for any other reason. Okay, so sometimes I talk a lot and it just all comes out at once, so I have to remember to breathe. Okay, so a little bit of a recap buyers have options and opportunities to cancel escrow and walk away with their full earnest money deposit back. Sellers can only cancel if the buyer is not performing in the agreed upon time frame that they've agreed to do those things. Now, the buyers have to remove their contingencies in writing. It doesn't just get automatically removed on day 10 or whatever you guys agreed upon. They have to say, I agree to remove my contingency. So that is why it's important for the buyers to feel comfortable, confident, and aware of what they're doing when they remove those contingencies. And also that's why it's important for a seller to choose a buyer that they feel will act in accordance to the agreement that they have offered and submitted. So it takes good agents on both sides to communicate and help move the transaction along. And just wanted to share a little bit of the ins and outs of a contract, of a deal, how it goes, the timeline, and how deals can cancel. I hope that is helpful. I hope you have learned something. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I will see you guys next week. Have a good one. Bye.